The galaxy had faced wars before. It had survived invasions, star-borne plagues, and endless clashes between rival empires. But this was different. This was not a war of territory or politics. This was not a hunger for resources or a dispute over trade routes. This was something that threatened not just one world, not just one species, but every single living thing in the stars. The empires that once bickered and fought suddenly went silent, united by the same fear. For the first time in thousands of years, the galaxy looked outward not with ambition, but with dread. The threat appeared without warning. A black tide spilling from the dark beyond mapped space. Entire fleets vanished. Colonies went dark. Planetary defenses designed to withstand any assault fell silent in minutes. Survivors spoke of a force that did not conquer, did not negotiate, and did not leave anything behind. They said it moved like a storm, but with purpose. Ships that tried to flee were pulled down and broken apart. Cities that tried to resist burned until nothing remained but ash drifting in space. It was not an enemy that could be reasoned with. It was a force that consumed. The great powers of the galaxy, proud and ancient, were the first to fall. Their fleets clashed against the oncoming wave, only to be torn apart with frightening ease. Weapons that had ended rebellions in a single strike barely scratched the surface of this new enemy. It was fast, it was brutal, and it learned with every battle. The more the galaxy resisted, the stronger it seemed to become. And with every defeat, hope slipped further away. In council chambers, leaders argued. Some wanted to surrender. Others demanded new alliances or desperate last stands. But none of it mattered. The enemy did not want surrender. The enemy did not want peace. The enemy only wanted to erase. The galaxy's brightest minds calculated timelines, and the numbers were grim. Whole sectors would be gone within years, and the core worlds would follow. No one had the strength to stop it. No one. Except maybe for the one world that had always been underestimated. Earth. For centuries, humanity had been a curiosity to the greater galaxy. Too young, too reckless, too unpredictable. A species known for pushing limits, for surviving disasters, for refusing to bow even when crushed. Humanity was not the strongest, nor the most advanced. But there was something about them that unnerved the older races. They had a way of turning their weaknesses into weapons. Where others saw chaos, humans found opportunity. Where others surrendered, humans fought harder. In the darkest moments of history, they did not vanish. They adapted. So when the desperate call went out, Earth answered. Not with fleets, not with armies, not with vast resources or ancient secrets. Humanity sent something far smaller, something that, to the rest of the galaxy, looked like madness. They sent 10 men. No one understood it. The council laughed at the idea. 10 men against a force that had crushed billions, 10 men where entire navies had failed. It was an insult, they said, a joke in the face of extinction. But Earth was serious. They said these 10 were enough. They said numbers didn't matter. They said humanity had faced impossible odds before and survived not by strength of arms alone, but by will. And these men carried that will like a weapon sharper than any blade. The 10 were not chosen at random. Each one carried scars, not just on their bodies, but deep in their lives. They were soldiers, yes, but also survivors of battles that should have ended them. Each had been tested in ways the galaxy could not understand. Some had faced the crushing silence of deep space, cut off from all contact, surviving where no one else could. Others had fought wars on Earth itself, where the environment, the enemy, and even time itself seemed stacked against them. These men were not just warriors. They were the embodiment of something the galaxy had never seen before, the sheer, unyielding refusal to die. Their weapons were not the most advanced. Their armor was not the strongest. But humanity's strength had never come from technology alone. It came from creativity, from stubbornness, from the kind of thinking that others dismissed as reckless. Until it worked. These 10 carried strategies, instincts, and a kind of ruthless imagination that no machine or empire could replicate. They didn't just fight battles. They found ways to win them when winning was supposed to be impossible. When they first walked into the council chamber, the galaxy's leaders whispered in disbelief. They looked so ordinary. 10 humans, standing among towering alien figures, looked small and fragile. No advanced exosuits, no glowing weapons, no signs of divine power. Just men in uniforms that had seen better days. They didn't bow, they didn't posture, they didn't even try to reassure anyone. They simply looked at the maps, listened to the reports, and nodded. And then, with quiet confidence, they said, "We'll handle it." No one believed them. How could they? But disbelief did not stop them. Within days, they were gone, boarding a ship built not for size or spectacle, but for speed and precision. They carried no grand banners. They did not broadcast their mission across the stars. They slipped into the shadows, heading straight toward the storm that had consumed whole civilizations. What happened next is a story whispered in fragments. Some say they infiltrated the heart of the enemy and struck it from within. Others claim they unleashed weapons so dangerous that even humanity feared to use them until that moment. There are tales of battles fought in silence, of sacrifices that shook even the hardest hearts, of clever traps and brutal ambushes that turned the tide where nothing else had. The galaxy does not know all the details. Humanity never shared the full truth. But one thing is certain. The tide changed after they arrived. The wave slowed. The enemy faltered. For the first time since the threat appeared, there was hope. Entire fleets, inspired by the impossible, began to rally. Worlds that had prepared to surrender now sharpened their blades. And everywhere, one question lingered on the edge of every conversation, every report, every whispered rumor. What could 10 men possibly have done to bring an unstoppable force to its knees? The galaxy still does not know. Some believe the humans made a pact with something even darker. Others think they found the enemy's one hidden weakness. A few whisper that they did not return at all, that the men became part of the legend, sacrificing themselves so that others could live. But humanity does not speak of it. They only look back with quiet eyes and say that those 10 men were enough. And now, with the galaxy waiting, watching the stars with nervous breath, a new fear spreads. Because if those 10 men could stand against the greatest threat the galaxy has ever faced, then what else is humanity capable of? The story does not end there. Because the enemy was not defeated completely. It was wounded, slowed, forced back. But deep in the silence of space, it still stirs. It still waits. And somewhere out there, the shadows move once more. And the question remains, when it rises again, will humanity send 10 men once more? Or will they unleash something far greater? The galaxy had never been a quiet place. Empires rose and fell, alliances formed and shattered, and countless species struggled to carve their place in the stars. But even in all that chaos, there had always been a kind of balance. Conflicts burned hot, but eventually cooled. Wars raged, but always ended with treaties or exhaustion. What came now was different. There were no demands, no broadcasts, no face to argue with. It was a threat that consumed without words, and the silence it left behind was worse than the destruction itself. Long before the 10 men departed, whispers of the enemy spread like fire through broken channels. Refugee ships arrived in systems already overcrowded, telling stories that made hardened commanders pale. They spoke of skies turning black with swarms of machines, of cities drowned in storms of fire, of weapons that bent space itself. But what frightened listeners most was not the violence. It was the precision. This enemy did not just attack randomly. It studied, adapted, and perfected its strikes. Every failed resistance was followed by a stronger assault. Every defense line that seemed to hold collapsed days later as if the enemy had learned every weakness. The galaxy had faced predators before, but this one was something else. It wasn't mindless. It wasn't desperate. It wasn't even cruel. It was inevitable. A force that didn't stop, didn't hesitate, and didn't care about victories or glory. It only erased. That was why the galaxy turned to Earth. Not because humanity was the most powerful, not because they had fleets greater than anyone else, but because humanity had survived the impossible time and time again. To the older empires, humanity was reckless, dangerous, and unrefined. To themselves, they were simply used to being underestimated. The story of the 10 men began long before they ever stood in the council chambers. Each one carried a history that shaped them into something the galaxy could never measure by rank or numbers. One had fought in wars so brutal on Earth that the scars still marked his body, a reminder of battles where no one should have walked away. Another had survived isolation in deep space, his ship adrift for months, yet somehow returning alive when others would have given in to despair. Each man was chosen not for medals, not for fame, but for the simple fact that they refused to break. Their training was not like anything the galaxy knew. Where other species trained soldiers to follow strict patterns, humanity drilled chaos into their warriors. They learned to improvise, to fight with whatever they had, to turn disaster into opportunity. Where alien soldiers relied on predictable formations, humans thrived in unpredictability. They were dangerous because they were never bound by one way of thinking, and these 10 were the sharpest edge of that mindset. Still, doubts spread. The galaxy's leaders looked at them and saw frailty. They measured muscle, weapons, technology, and found humanity lacking. But they never understood the truth. Humanity's weapon had never been its tools. It was the people, the stubborn, relentless drive to find a way no matter how hopeless it seemed. As the 10 prepared, stories began to spread among the ordinary citizens of the galaxy. Refugees whispered that perhaps these strange humans were not ordinary soldiers at all, but something far greater. Some called them madmen. Others said they were death wishers who had nothing left to lose. A few even believed they were Earth's most dangerous secret, a weapon hidden until the galaxy was desperate enough to ask for it. The truth was simpler, but no less terrifying. They were men who had seen what others could not endure and chosen to walk back into the fire anyway. The first stage of their mission was shrouded in secrecy. Officially, they were sent to observe, to gather intelligence where others had failed. But deep down, everyone knew observation was not enough. The galaxy had already studied the enemy. They knew what it looked like, how it moved, how it killed. Knowledge had not stopped it. Humanity's 10 were not there to watch. They were there to do something no one else had the courage to attempt. Even as they launched, rumors spread across the stars. Entire colonies gathered around flickering transmissions, listening for any word of their progress. Soldiers in faraway systems whispered about the humans, wondering if they could truly make a difference. Some scoffed, dismissing them as a distraction, a story to keep the masses calm. But others held on to the idea, because even if it was only a story, it was the first time anyone had spoken of hope in months. The enemy, meanwhile, did not pause. Entire sectors fell silent in the weeks after the 10 left. Survivors who fled described new horrors, adaptations that had not been seen before. The enemy was changing, as though it had already noticed humanity's defiance and was preparing for it. Fleets rushed to form defensive lines, but every day the noose tightened. Inside their ship, the 10 men studied what little they had. Reports, recordings, fragments of data salvaged from destroyed fleets. They listened to the voices of those who had fought and died, piecing together patterns others had missed. Where alien commanders saw hopelessness, they saw something different: opportunity. They noticed weaknesses not in the enemy's weapons, but in its rhythm. They saw flaws not in its strength, but in its confidence. The galaxy measured wars in terms of fleets, planets, numbers. Humanity measured wars in terms of survival. How much could be lost before the enemy lost more? How far could you bend before the other side broke first? These 10 carried that philosophy like a torch. But the deeper they traveled into the silent systems, the stranger the war became. They found ruined stations stripped of life, but untouched structurally, as though the enemy cared nothing for the metal and stone, only the living. They uncovered ships that had been abandoned mid-flight, their crews gone without signs of struggle. The recordings left behind were fractured, filled with screams that cut off too quickly. Something about it gnawed at them. The enemy wasn't simply wiping life away. It was taking something, learning something. The more they studied, the more unsettling the picture became. This was not a mindless hunger. It was strategy. It was patience. And it was watching. On one world, they discovered survivors hiding beneath the surface. Families too afraid to emerge even when human voices called to them. Their eyes told the story better than words. They had seen what happened to those who resisted, and their fear ran deeper than death. Yet when the 10 promised they would fight, the survivors wept. Not because they believed it, but because someone had dared to say it out loud. That was the difference. To the galaxy, resistance was foolish. To humanity, resistance was survival. Every day the 10 pressed further, and every day the enemy's shadow loomed larger. They could feel it, as though the dark itself leaned closer to listen. Somewhere in the silence, it was waiting. Somewhere ahead, the real war would begin. And in that silence, each of the 10 carried the same thought, though none dared speak it. If the galaxy was right, they would not return. But if humanity was right, if 10 men truly could stand against the greatest threat the galaxy had ever faced, then the war was about to change forever. The galaxy held its breath, waiting for the first whisper of what would come next. The deeper the 10 pushed into the silent sectors, the more the weight of the mission pressed down on them. Their ship drifted past broken hulks of vessels that had once carried thousands of soldiers. Now they were little more than tombs, metal shells with nothing left inside. The galaxy called them ghost fleets, and the name was fitting. They floated lifeless in the dark, engines cold, hulls torn apart, yet eerily intact in places where they should have been shattered. The enemy didn't simply destroy. It left reminders, warnings for whoever dared to come next. At first glance, these wrecks seemed abandoned, but the men knew better. They studied the ruins carefully, moving in silence, their every step heavy with caution. Some of the ships showed signs of being dissected, as if the enemy had taken them apart piece by piece to understand how they worked. Others were missing entire sections that looked as if they had simply been erased, not destroyed by fire or impact, but removed with surgical precision. The enemy wasn't only erasing life, it was learning, adapting, preparing for something bigger. One of the 10, the quietest among them, was the first to voice what they were all thinking. "It's not just consuming," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "It's studying us." The silence that followed was heavy, because the truth was clear. If the enemy could learn from every failed defense, then every defeat wasn't just a loss. It was fuel. Back on the council worlds, the leaders argued endlessly. Reports trickled in, delayed and incomplete, but enough to ignite debate. Some said humanity's 10 were wasting time chasing shadows, that their efforts would change nothing. Others, especially those who had lost entire sectors, clung to the idea that the humans had seen something no one else could. Ordinary citizens across the stars latched onto every rumor of their progress, their names spoken like talismans in crowded refugee camps. Yet even as hope spread, so did fear. If the humans failed, there would be nothing left to fall back on. Among the 10, disagreements simmered quietly. They had been chosen for their strength, but strength came in many forms, and not all of them aligned. One believed they had to strike hard and fast to hurt the enemy before it adapted again. Another argued for patience, to keep studying, to learn the enemy as it had learned them. Each voice carried weight, but no one dared fracture the group. They knew too well that unity was their only real weapon. Still, the tension lingered, a quiet reminder that even humanity's greatest strength, their stubbornness, could become a weakness if they weren't careful. The first real clash came on the edge of a ruined system. Sensors picked up faint signals, patterns that looked like distress calls but carried no origin point. It was a trap. They all knew it, yet they went anyway because what if it wasn't? What if survivors were still out there? That was the burden of being human. You couldn't ignore the chance, no matter how slim. What they found was worse than silence. The signals came from an abandoned colony, its surface scorched black. Buildings stood, but empty, hollow, stripped of life. In the center of the settlement, they found the source of the transmission, a tower rigged with repeating signals. It was bait. But the bait wasn't for them. It was for anyone desperate enough to answer, anyone still clinging to hope. And scattered around the tower were the remains of those who had come before. Ships half buried in ash, their crews gone. The men studied the scene with grim faces. This was the enemy's true cruelty, not its power, but its patience. It didn't just kill, it waited. It used hope itself as a weapon. That discovery shook them, though none admitted it aloud. They carried the knowledge with them, heavy and sharp, as they pushed further into the dark. For some, it fueled anger, a fire that burned hotter with every step. For others, it deepened the dread, the quiet sense that they were walking into a trap designed long before they ever left Earth. Meanwhile, far away, the galaxy's refugees built their own legends around the 10. Stories spread faster than truth. Some said the men were already striking victories in secret battles, crippling the enemy from within. Others whispered they had vanished, swallowed by the same silence that had taken everyone else. For those living in fear, it didn't matter which version was true. What mattered was that humanity had sent them, that someone, at least, was still fighting. Among the 10, bonds deepened in strange ways. They came from different places, different lives. Yet in the endless dark, they became something more than soldiers. In quiet hours, they shared stories of Earth, the storms, the oceans, the mountains, the crowded cities, things the galaxy couldn't understand, but which grounded them in ways no strategy could. To the galaxy, Earth was a young world, reckless and fragile. To them, it was proof that survival didn't require perfection. It required resilience. And resilience was tested again when they reached the next system. The enemy was there, not in overwhelming force, not in the swarms described by fleeing refugees, but in silence. Machines drifted between shattered moons, their forms shifting, almost organic, as if they were still growing. They moved slowly at first, scanning, circling, as though curious. The 10 watched from the safety of their ship, hearts steady, but heavy. This was the first real glimpse of what they were up against. They debated what to do. One argued they should strike, test the enemy, see how it reacted. Another said they should retreat, gather more data before risking a fight. The leader of the group listened quietly, then made the choice none of them wanted to hear. They would engage, but not to win. They would engage to learn. The clash was quick and brutal. The enemy moved with terrifying precision, responding to every tactic almost before it was tried. Weapons that should have shredded metal barely slowed them. They adapted in seconds, shifting formations, striking back with impossible accuracy. The humans fought with everything they had, not for victory, but for understanding. Every shot fired, every maneuver tested, was a question, and the enemy's answer was always sharp. In the end, they escaped, their ship battered and systems failing. But they carried something more valuable than survival. They carried knowledge. The enemy wasn't invincible. It was fast, adaptive, relentless. Yes, but in the chaos of the fight, they had seen hesitation. A fraction of a second where the machines faltered as if confused. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. That was the crack in the armor. Yet even with that sliver of hope, the cost was clear. They had seen how close they came to being erased. They knew how easily one mistake could end everything, and worse, they felt the enemy watching them. Not just fighting, but observing, learning them as they were learning it. Back in the council chambers, reports of the clash spread like wildfire. Some called it proof that humanity had found a way. Others warned it was a death sentence, that the humans had only drawn the enemy's attention. The leaders argued, the empires wavered, but the people listened to only one thing. Humanity had fought, and they had lived. For the 10, the path ahead was clear and more dangerous than ever. They had touched the edge of the storm and survived. Now they had to push deeper, into places no one had returned from, carrying not just their mission but the fragile weight of hope. And though none of them said it, the same thought echoed in every mind. The enemy now knew them. It would come for them again, and next time, it would not hesitate. The clash in the ruined system had left more than scars on their ship. It had changed the 10. They had gone into the fight with theories, with doubts, with fragments of belief. They had come out of it with proof, fragile, terrifying proof, that the enemy was not untouchable. But it also meant the enemy had seen them. It had felt them. And now, every star they passed seemed heavier, every silence sharper, as if the darkness itself was listening for them. Their ship limped on, patched together with human ingenuity and a stubborn refusal to quit. Where other crews might have grounded themselves, the 10 worked tirelessly, keeping the vessel alive with tools and ideas that would have baffled the galaxy's finest engineers. Wires twisted, plating welded in uneven layers, power rerouted in ways that should not have worked, but did. That was how humanity survived, not with elegance, but with grit. Still, every time the hull creaked, they were reminded of how close they had come to disappearing. They pushed further into the silence, and with every light year, the signs of the enemy's presence grew stronger. Whole systems were stripped of life, their planets left hollow and barren. The stars themselves seemed dimmer, as if drained by the shadow that had passed through. The men grew quiet, their conversations shorter, their laughter rare. They were focused, determined. But beneath the steel there was something else. The awareness that they were walking deeper into the mouth of the storm, and there would be no easy way back. Their next discovery unsettled even the hardest among them. In the wreckage of a fleet that had been erased weeks earlier, they found traces of something unexpected. Human technology. Not theirs, not Earth's, but scavenged pieces, shards of weapons, fragments of armor that the enemy had kept intact. They weren't destroyed, just stored, as if studied. The realization struck hard. The enemy wasn't only learning from their failures, it was learning from humanity itself. Every fight, every desperate maneuver, every strange tactic, they were teaching it. And sooner or later, it would use that knowledge against them. That knowledge gnawed at them. Some grew angry, their voices sharp in strategy sessions. "We can't keep fighting like this," one said. "Every time we hit them, they hit harder after. We're making it stronger." Others pushed back. "If we stop fighting, then it wins without lifting a finger. Better it learns our tricks than it breaks us before we try." The debates grew harsher, but each time their leader cut through the noise with a calm that held them together. They hadn't come to play safe. They hadn't come to surrender. They had come to find a way. Back across the galaxy, rumors swelled. Refugee camps whispered of battles that no official report confirmed. Merchants spoke of human victories in hidden systems, of fleets saved by impossible strategies. Children grew up hearing stories of 10 men who stood where no one else dared, their faces blurred into myth. Hope spread, but with it came fear. If the humans were truly fighting the enemy at its core, then what happened when the enemy struck back? It was during one of their long stretches through dead space that the first true sign of pursuit appeared. a flicker on the sensors, faint, distant, but undeniable. Something was following them, not close enough to attack, not far enough to ignore. The 10 watched the readings in silence, and though no one said it, they all knew the truth. The enemy had marked them. It was letting them go deeper. It was watching, waiting. The choice before them was brutal. Turn back, and they risked leading the enemy straight to the fragile system still holding on. Push forward, and they stepped into the unknown, further than any living soul had returned from. It was no choice at all. They pushed forward. Their journey took them to a system unlike the others. At first glance, it seemed untouched. The planets were whole, the stations orbiting them still powered. But no signals came, no voices reached out. When they landed, they found cities still standing, lights still burning, but no people. It was as if the population had vanished in a single breath, leaving everything behind. Food on tables, tools mid-use. Lives paused in an instant. The silence of that world haunted them. It wasn't destruction, it wasn't fire and ruin. It was absence. And it left a question none of them wanted to ask. Where had they gone? They searched, moving carefully through the hollow streets, weapons ready. In the deeper levels of the city, they found their answer, or at least a piece of it. Strange machines, unlike the ones they had fought, scattered through the underground. They weren't weapons, not exactly. They were containers, and inside, faint traces of energy pulsed, almost like a heartbeat. It didn't take much imagination to see what they were meant for. The people of that world hadn't been destroyed. They had been taken. The discovery shook them in ways the enemy's violence never had. This wasn't just erasure. It was collection, purposeful, directed. But for what? None of them had an answer, and the silence of the city gave them none. The more they uncovered, the clearer the truth became. The enemy wasn't a storm, mindless and endless. It had a goal, a design, and humanity's presence here was not unexpected. It was part of that design. The tension among the 10 grew heavier. Some wanted to destroy the machines, to deny the enemy whatever it was doing. Others warned against it. "We don't know enough," one said. "We destroy this, and we lose the chance to understand what it's building." The argument nearly tore them apart, voices rising in anger until the leader ended it with words none of them wanted to hear. "We don't have the luxury of being right. We only have the chance to choose." They chose to leave the machines intact, though it gnawed at them. As they lifted off, the sensors screamed with warnings. The pursuit had closed in. The enemy was no longer waiting. The chase began. Their ship, patched and weary, strained against the limits of its engines. Behind them, the darkness moved. Not in one shape, but many, shifting and flowing, cutting off escape routes with terrifying precision. Every evasive maneuver, every desperate tactic was met with countermeasures almost instantly, as though the enemy already knew what they would do. The men fought their ship like they fought everything, reckless, desperate, alive. They pushed it through asteroid fields, skimmed the surfaces of dead moons, bent gravity wells to slingshot themselves through impossible paths. Each time, the enemy followed. Each time, it came closer. And then, on the edge of collapse, they found something unexpected. A signal, faint and broken, but human. Not from Earth, not from any fleet. It was old, buried deep in the static, but unmistakably human. They followed it, not because it was safe, but because it was the only thread left to grasp. The chase carried them into a region no chart had marked, a place of warped space and fractured light. The enemy closed in, shadows pressing from every direction. Their ship shook, alarms screamed, systems failed one by one. And at the heart of the storm, the signal pulsed stronger, leading them toward something vast and hidden. What they saw at the edge of their vision was not a planet, not a station, but something older, something massive, a structure buried in the folds of space itself, its surface etched with scars of battles no record remembered. And at its heart, the human signal called to them, steady and deliberate, as though it had been waiting. The enemy closed in around them, a wall of shifting darkness, leaving no escape. The ship groaned under the pressure, and the 10 prepared for the fight they had always known would come. But even as they readied themselves, their eyes stayed on the structure ahead, on the impossible promise hidden in its silence. Because if there truly was a human signal waiting inside, then the war was far larger than anyone had ever imagined. And in that moment, hanging between survival and annihilation, with the enemy pressing from all sides and the unknown calling from ahead, the 10 understood the truth. They were not just fighting to survive. They were standing on the edge of something that could decide the fate of the entire galaxy. The storm was here, the climax was coming, and there was no turning back. The ship shuddered as it broke through the last layer of the storm, metal groaning under stresses it was never built to survive. The 10 clung to their stations, fighting to hold it together with hands, grit, and the kind of instinct only humans carried. Behind them, the enemy pressed like a tide, shadows folding and shifting, sealing every escape. Ahead, the ancient structure loomed larger, its surface covered in scars so deep they looked like wounds left by wars that predated everything they knew, and through it all, the human signal pulsed, steady, deliberate, impossible. It shouldn't have been there. No human colony had ever reached this far. No record spoke of ships traveling beyond mapped space. Yet the signal carried the unmistakable rhythm of Earth's language, encoded in a way only humanity would recognize. That truth unsettled them more than the enemy behind them. Because if the signal was real, then someone had been here long before they arrived. The decision was made in a breath. They couldn't turn back. The enemy's net was closing. Their only hope lay in that structure, whatever it was, whatever waited within. Engines screamed as the ship dove toward the surface, weaving through jagged debris that floated like broken bones in orbit. The enemy followed, closing in tighter, but held back just enough to make the men realize something chilling. It wasn't rushing to finish them. It was herding them, driving them toward the structure as if this was the plan all along. They broke through the atmosphere, if it could even be called that. The sky was fractured, light bending strangely, shadows clinging like mist. The surface of the structure stretched endlessly beneath them, its architecture alien yet hauntingly deliberate. Towers jutted from the metal plains, massive and silent, their angles sharp enough to look like blades stabbed into the skin of a god. At the center, where the signal pulsed brightest, stood a vast chamber, a dome cracked open by ancient fire. They landed hard, their ship collapsing in exhaustion as much as damage. The men stumbled out, weapons ready, eyes scanning the alien terrain. The signal led them inside, down corridors etched with symbols no one could read. The air was heavy, thick with something that wasn't dust, wasn't mist, but felt alive in their lungs. And deeper still, the sound began. A faint hum, like machinery half asleep, waiting to wake. They followed the pulse until they reached the chamber. There, in the center, was the source. Not a beacon, not a machine, a ship. It was unmistakably human, though older than any design they had ever seen. Its hull was scarred and weathered, its lines simple, almost primitive compared to the sleek crafts they had flown. Yet the markings were clear, painted across its battered surface, Earth's insignia, faded but undeniable. The ship had been here for centuries, maybe longer, buried inside a structure no record of humanity had ever acknowledged. The men froze, the weight of the discovery pressing harder than any enemy fleet. Humanity had been here before, long before the Council ever invited Earth into the galactic fold, long before anyone believed humans had reached beyond their own skies. And that raised a question none of them could answer. How? One of the 10 broke the silence. We weren't the first. His voice echoed in the hollow chamber, carrying a tremor none of them wanted to admit they felt. As if in response, the hum grew louder. Lights flickered to life along the walls, dim at first, then sharper, brighter. The chamber awakened around them. The ancient structure wasn't dead. It was waiting, and their arrival had triggered it. The men raised their weapons instinctively, but there was nothing to fight. Instead, projections flared into existence. Not words, not images, memories. They filled the chamber, fragments of battles fought long ago. Fleets of ships, human and alien alike, clashing against the same enemy they faced now. The machines, the shadows. It was all there, but different, younger, cruder. The enemy had been here before, and humanity had fought it. The realization struck hard. This wasn't the first war. This wasn't a new threat. The galaxy had faced this enemy long ago, and humanity, somehow, had stood at the heart of that battle. But why had no one remembered? Why had no records survived? The projections shifted, showing the ancient human ship locked in battle, its crew fighting with desperate brilliance. They set traps, turned debris into weapons, tore victory from nothing but willpower. The 10 recognized the spirit instantly. It was the same defiance they carried now. But then the images darkened. The ship fell, swallowed by fire, its crew lost. The records ended in silence. The chamber dimmed, the hum fading until only the steady pulse of the signal remained. The 10 stood motionless, staring at the ancient wreck before them. Questions burned in their minds. Had humanity been hiding this truth? Or had the galaxy erased it, burying the memory of humanity's past victories because it feared what humans could do? Before they could speak, the enemy arrived. The ground trembled as shadows poured into the chamber, twisting and folding into shapes too fluid to be machines, too precise to be alive. They did not rush to kill. They circled, waiting, as if the 10 had delivered themselves exactly where they were meant to be. The leader of the group felt the weight of realization settle in his chest. The enemy hadn't just found them, it had led them here. The true trap wasn't the chase. It was the discovery. The enemy had wanted them to see this, to know that humanity had fought it before, and lost. The men tightened their grips on their weapons, hearts pounding. Yet even as the enemy closed in, something stirred inside them. The projections had not ended in complete defeat. The ancient crew had fought to the very end, their defiance echoing across centuries. If the enemy wanted to show them despair, it had failed. All it had done was remind them of what it meant to be human. But the danger was undeniable. The enemy wasn't here just to kill them. It wanted to study them up close, to finish what it had begun with the ancient crew. To erase humanity not just from the present, but from history itself. Their leader's voice cut through the tension. It brought us here because it thinks history will repeat itself. He paused, eyes steady as the shadows loomed closer. Let's prove it wrong. The men spread out, weapons raised, their backs to one another. The chamber pulsed with light, the hum rising again, louder now, as if the ancient structure itself was reacting to the standoff. Outside, the storm raged, the enemy's fleet closing in, sealing off any escape. Inside, the 10 faced a wall of shadows that moved with inhuman precision. They were outnumbered, outmatched, trapped in the very heart of the enemy's snare. But there was one truth the enemy had never understood. Not in the last war, not in this one. Humanity didn't measure survival in numbers. They measured it in defiance, in the refusal to bow even when the stars themselves fell silent. The second twist had been revealed. Humanity had fought this war before, and now the 10 stood on the same ground, facing the same enemy, carrying the same impossible burden. But this time, the galaxy was watching. This time, the stakes were higher than survival. Because if the enemy won again, there would be nothing left for anyone. The chamber shook as the first strike fell. The storm had broken, the trap had sprung, and the true battle was about to begin. The first strike tore across the chamber in a flash of dark energy, smashing against the walls with a sound that shook the marrow of their bones. The 10 braced, the air ripping with static as shadows closed in from every angle. They fired back, their weapons sparking against forms that twisted and reformed, never staying solid long enough to fall. Every shot was desperation, every breath was borrowed, yet none of them stepped back. The leader barked orders that cut through the chaos. "Keep them moving! Don't let them settle!" His voice was hoarse, but it steadied the line. The men moved like one, not soldiers but survivors, their rhythm forged in battles where no one expected them to live. They slammed explosives into walls, turned broken fragments of the chamber into traps, forcing the enemy to adapt, to bend. For every shadow that collapsed into smoke, another surged forward. Then the hum deepened. The walls shook, light bursting from the cracks like veins of fire. The ancient structure was no longer dormant. It was awake, feeding on the conflict, responding to the presence of humans who refused to surrender. The projections returned, flickering through the smoke and chaos, images of the ancient crew fighting their final stand. Only now the images shifted. They no longer ended in silence. The 10 saw new fragments, hidden before. The ancient ship's captain, bloodied but unbroken, dragging himself into the heart of the structure. He pressed something into the walls, words lost but his defiance unmistakable. And then the light swallowed everything. One of the 10 realized what it meant. The structure wasn't just a ruin, it was a weapon. The ancient crew hadn't died in defeat. They had locked something away. And now, with the presence of humans once again inside its heart, it was ready to release it. The leader shouted, his voice raw with urgency. "It's not a trap! It's a trigger! Keep them here!" They fought harder, drawing the enemy deeper into the chamber, every step back measured, deliberate. The shadows swarmed, pressing closer, but the humans refused to give ground freely. They bled for every inch, and in their defiance, the chamber blazed brighter. The hum rose into a roar, a vibration that rattled teeth and burned in their skulls. And then it happened. The floor split open, light tearing upward like a spear. The enemy reeled, its forms collapsing in confusion as the structure revealed its core. It wasn't a weapon in the sense of a gun or a bomb. It was worse. It was a memory forged not in images, but in resonance. It unleashed the echo of humanity's first war with the enemy, a wave of thought and defiance so powerful it struck like a storm. The shadows staggered, folding in on themselves, their perfect unity shattering under the weight of something they could not understand. Human defiance. The echo was not of victory, but of refusal, of men and women who had stood against the impossible and chosen to fight anyway. That refusal burned into the enemy's collective mind, a poison against its order. The 10 pressed the attack, their voices raw, shouting into the storm as their weapons found purchase at last. Shadows tore apart, dissolving into nothing as the chamber amplified every act of resistance, every strike of willpower. Humanity's presence was not weakness, it was the key. But victory came at a cost. The chamber wasn't just releasing its power, it was consuming everything around it. The structure trembled, breaking apart as the resonance threatened to collapse the entire world in on itself. The leader realized it in an instant. They weren't going to survive unless someone stayed behind to hold the connection open. The silence in his eyes told the others what he meant to do before he spoke. But one of the men stepped forward first. "No," he said, steady and sure. "We came here as 10. We leave as 10. Or not at all." And for the first time, the leader hesitated. Humanity had always been willing to sacrifice for victory, but in that moment, he saw something greater. The enemy had always expected humans to break, to give in when pressed too far. But the truth of humanity wasn't sacrifice. It was unity. It was standing together, no matter the odds. They joined hands on the controls, every one of them linking into the chamber's core, pouring their strength, their will, their humanity into it. 10 voices, 10 hearts, 10 lives burning brighter than the storm around them. The chamber responded. Light flared, ripping through the structure, bursting upward into the sky like a beacon. The storm outside shattered, the enemy's fleet convulsing as the resonance reached them, tearing their unity apart. Across the void, their order collapsed, ships breaking into chaos, their perfect control undone by the echo of human defiance. The ground shook as the chamber gave its final surge. The enemy dissolved into nothing, their shadows unraveling, leaving only silence. The storm cleared, and then the chamber fell still. The 10 collapsed, their bodies drained, their ship ruined, the chamber quiet once more. But the galaxy was no longer the same. The greatest threat it had ever faced had been broken, not by fleets, not by weapons, but by 10 humans who refused to yield. They had won, or so they thought. As they pulled themselves to their feet, battered but alive, the hum returned. Softer this time, almost like a whisper. And then the projections came again. Only these were not of the past. They were of the future. The men saw fleets, alien fleets, countless in number, turning their weapons not against the enemy, but against Earth. They saw councils and empires trembling at what had just happened. The humans had not only survived the greatest threat in the galaxy, they had revealed a truth no one wanted to believe, that humanity was the only species capable of facing the impossible and winning, and the galaxy would never forgive them for it. The leader looked at his men, his voice rough with exhaustion but steady. "We beat the enemy." His gaze hardened, the weight of the vision heavy on his shoulders. Now the real fight begins. The chamber went silent, the ancient echoes fading into darkness. The storm outside had ended, the shadows gone, but the greater storm had only just begun. Because for the first time in history, the galaxy saw humanity not as fragile newcomers, but as the greatest threat it had ever faced. The silence after the storm was unlike anything the 10 had ever known. For hours they sat inside the broken chamber, listening to the faint hum fade into nothing, their bodies aching, their minds heavy with what they had seen. The structure had gone quiet, but its message lingered, carved into them deeper than any scar. They had survived the enemy, yes, but survival was not the end. It was only a doorway into something larger. They patched what little remained of their ship. Metal groaned, circuits flickered, and half the systems refused to respond. But humans had always been better at fixing the unfixable than building the perfect. Piece by piece, they coaxed life back into the vessel, enough to lift it from the surface and carry it into the emptiness above. When they broke atmosphere, the wreckage of the enemy's fleet still drifted, scattered and silent, proof of what had been done here. The galaxy would soon notice. The signal of their victory would not remain hidden. The men looked at one another, each knowing the weight of what came next. They had faced the greatest threat the galaxy had ever known, and lived to tell of it. But the visions in the chamber showed the truth. Their defiance would not be celebrated. It would be feared. Humanity had shown its strength, and strength always drew suspicion. On the return journey, none of them spoke much. Each man wrestled with the same thought. How would Earth respond when they learned the truth? Would they be proud, or would they tremble at the consequences? Would the galaxy rally to them, or turn against them in fear? No answer came, only silence, broken by the hum of the ship as it carried them home. When at last they reached human space, the news spread faster than they could prepare. The council summoned them, demanding explanations, demanding proof. The 10 told their story plainly, describing the ancient structure, the enemy's trap, and the way humanity's will had turned the tide. At first, disbelief echoed through the chamber of leaders. How could 10 men succeed where fleets had failed? But then came the recordings. The data pulled from the structure, the images of the projections, the resonance itself. The truth was undeniable. The galaxy reacted just as the chamber's vision had shown. Some races cheered, praising humanity for saving them all from a force none could withstand. Others recoiled, their voices sharp with fear, whispering that humans were too dangerous, too unpredictable. "If 10 of them can break the enemy," one alien delegate said, trembling, "what happens when billions stand together?" The council fractured. Old alliances cracked under the pressure of this new truth. Earth had risen in one act from fragile newcomer to center of every conversation, every strategy, every fear. And in that moment, the 10 understood the true cost of their victory. They had not just defeated the greatest threat to the galaxy. They had replaced it. Back on Earth, families embraced them as heroes. Crowds filled the streets, cheering their return, showering them with words like savior, legend, unstoppable. But behind the celebrations, the whispers grew louder. Governments prepared for the inevitable shift. Militaries rushed to study the resonance, desperate to understand how the chamber had chosen humanity. The 10 saw it clearly. Their people were no longer treated as equal members of the galactic community. They were being studied, measured, weighed like a new weapon no one could predict. Yet through it all, there was pride too. For all the fear, for all the suspicion, one truth could not be erased. Humanity had faced the impossible and stood unbroken. The galaxy might fear them, but it could never again dismiss them. Humanity's spirit, once doubted and mocked, now burned across the stars as undeniable. In the months that followed, the galaxy shifted in subtle ways. Some species sought alliances with Earth, drawn not by fear, but by hope. They saw in humanity the spark of survival, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, someone could still fight back. Others built walls, withdrawing behind fleets and fortresses, preparing for the day they believed humans would turn their defiance against them. The 10 scattered to different corners of Earth, but their bond remained unbroken. Each carried the memories of that chamber, the echo of voices from a forgotten war, the reminder that humanity's story was older and stranger than anyone realized. At night, when silence pressed heavy, they wondered about the ancient crew who had stood in the same place centuries before. Who were they? How had they reached so far beyond the maps of their time? And why had their story been buried until now? One day, a message came from the council. Quiet, cautious, hidden behind layers of secrecy. Another structure had been found. Different sector, same design, same hum, faint but rising. The 10 read the report in silence, each feeling the weight settle on them again. The enemy had been beaten, but not erased. Shadows had a way of returning. They knew then that their battle had not been the last. It had only been the first spark of something larger. The galaxy might fear humanity, might resist their rise, but when the shadows returned, and they would return, there would be no choice but to turn once more to Earth. Because humans, for all their flaws, carried one truth no other race could match. They never stopped fighting. The leader gathered the others one final time. They stood together on the edge of a quiet sea, far from cities and councils, watching the horizon glow with the light of dawn. "The galaxy doesn't trust us," he said. "Maybe it never will. But it doesn't matter. We know who we are. We've seen it. And when the time comes again, we'll be ready." The others nodded, no words needed. Their bond was enough. They had stood in the heart of the storm and lived, not because they were the strongest, not because they had the best weapons, but because they refused to surrender. That was what it meant to be human, and no shadow, no council, no empire could erase that truth. As the sun rose higher, its light spilling across the waves, the 10 knew their story was not one of endings, but of beginnings. The galaxy had seen them. It had judged them. It had feared them. But it had also learned something it could never forget, that even against the greatest threat, even when the stars themselves seemed to fall silent, humanity would rise. And so the tale ended not with despair, but with a promise carried in the hearts of 10 men who had walked into the dark and returned with fire, a promise that humanity's spirit, restless and unyielding, would always stand when others fell. The galaxy's greatest threat had been defeated. The future was uncertain, the challenges vast, but one truth remained clear. Earth had sent 10, and they had changed everything. And as long as that spirit endured, no shadow could ever truly conquer the light.